The subject of the discussion today is going to be the response of the Muslim intelligentsia to the increasing secularization of the various nation-states in the Muslim world, and how the response moved from being more of a cultural definition as to what the challenge of the West means, to more of a socio-political response in light of the control of the nation-states by indigenous elites or indigenous leaders. So if you view the Muslim world or the thought of the Muslim intelligentsia of the 20th century as being partly responsive to the political conditions of their times. So a lot of the responses, for example, of Muhammad Abdul or Rashid Rida was related to the continuing influence and direct control by foreign powers of the Muslim world. The theme changed in the 1930s and 40s because the direct rule was no longer valid. Generally, most colonial powers withdrew from direct rule after World War II, and there were nation-states formed or continued, but under the leadership of domestic elites or domestic leaders. And the growth of the change in Muslim ideas and ideologies in the 1940s and 50s is really quite pronounced. You can sense it reading the various writings of the main figures of that period. And you can see that there was a marked change, a dichotomy between the pre-war period and the post-war period. And that the challenge was seen more in terms of domestic conditions rather than in terms of the classical response of responding to imperialism or responding to direct non-Muslim power. And here we see the genesis of the ideology of the Islamist movement that moved from defining the enemy, if you want to call it that, or defining the other as being foreign, i.e. non-indigenous, to being indigenous. It moved from defining it in terms of colonial powers, in terms of imported ideologies, in terms of imported cultures, into defining it in terms of the domestic conditions, domestic indigenous elites. And this subtle shift began to become more and more evident as the power of secular nationalist ideologies imposed themselves on the socio-economic and cultural order in the Muslim world. You have, for example, countries like Egypt, which fell from being, or changed from being a corrupt but liberal monarchy that tolerated a certain degree of personal and social freedoms, into a military-controlled dictatorship that used the language and the symbols of nationalism to impose its ideological perceptions on society. You had, for example, the condition in Pakistan, which was created in order to become, theoretically, a homeland for Muslims, and ended up very soon thereafter, in 1947, 1948, as being the elites that ruled the country, including Muhammad Ali Jinnah and his subsequent followers, people like Jafar Ali Khan. They interpreted the role of Islam as being purely that religious activity that is confined to the private space, and that the state and society as a whole could better be organized according to Western principles. So if you're a Muslim or Islamically inclined thinker or activist of the 1940s and 1950s, you will see in front of you the gradual erosion of the alliance that you may have formed with nationalists and military types against the foreign enemy, against the other, into being more of a domestic cleavage. And here is where the Islamic movement and Islamic thought generally began to see its evolution in terms of its response to the growth of nationalism, secularism, militarism, in some cases overt socialism and communism, like in South Yemen or like in certain countries in Africa. And you see all around you a sense of betrayal of the promise that somehow the Muslim world will reorient itself towards its authentic indigenous roots, and instead it found itself as being poorly or corruptly led by groups that have been completely identified with the imperial or Western/secular project. We talked about Hassan Banna last time, Sheikh Hassan Banna, and the rise of the Ikhwan Muslimin. Now we're talking about two other people who, in their own way, are seminal figures in the growth of Islamic thought of the mid-20th century. And these two people are Mullah Maududi They were both, to some extent, contemporaries. Although Abu Allawi was somewhat older than Sayyid Qutb. Abu Allawi was born in India, in what is now known as the Hyderabad province. That's the place called Aurangabad in southern India. He was born in 1903 to a family that traced its lineage to the Prophet ﷺ. He considered himself to be a Sayyid and was always addressed as a Sayyid. And from a long line of Shuyukh of the Chishti order, Chishti Sufi order. So his father was quite a well-known adept of the Chishtiya. And in his later life, when he was in his 40s, he basically went into complete seclusion and disconnected with the world. So Abu Alla's early life was within an environment that was immersed, as it were, in love of the Prophet ﷺ. He was very proud of his progeny, his descendant from the Prophet ﷺ, and in an environment that was infused to a large extent by love of the Prophet and of Ahlul Bayt ﷺ. And this comes out later in his writings. His mother was of Turkish origin. So, in his own way, he seems to have combined the main currents, as it were, or the main building blocks of the Muslim personality. On one side, Arab, of his Sayyid origins, another side, Turco-Persian, and another side being raised and born in an Indian environment. So he combined what he thought were all the various components of the true profile of a Muslim, a non-national Muslim. And he never conceived, and we'll come to that later, so he never conceived of his Islam in national or racial terms, even though he played a large part in developing the underpinnings of Muslim separatism in India, although not to the point where he may have contributed to the partition of India. Of course, Abu Alla is known mainly as being the founder and the leading light of the Jama'at Islami in Pakistan. And prior to that in India, which is probably the longest lived and the most established of the Islamic movements of the subcontinent. Again, if you go back to the earlier lectures on the Indian Muslim movement, particularly the thoughts of Kalam Azad and people like Shibli Na'mani and so on, the Aligarh school, Muslim Aligarh school, you can find Maududi was influenced by them. He was influenced particularly by the newspaper Al-Hilal, which was edited in his time by Abu Kalam Azad. He mastered Arabic. Maududi mastered Arabic at an early age. In fact, he was very, very fluent in the language, to the point where he was giving lectures himself in Arabic while he was only a teenager. And he did a number of at a very early age, important translations of key Arabic works. Surprisingly, he was also a translator of Mullah Sadra and was one of the first or the most vernacular. His translation was most accessible in terms of the Urdu to those who sought that form of philosophy in India. Mullah Sadra, I want to just as in parenthesis, was extremely well considered in philosophical circles in India, both Shia and Sunni, and was considered that no complete philosophical training could be achieved without an immersion in Mullah Sadra. So he transcended basically his ethnicity and his sectarian affiliations. And even today you'll find that the school outside of Iran that cherishes most the thoughts and methods of Mullah Sadra is in India. So when he translated the Asfar al-Arba'a, which you might have seen are very large and very complex, it's a very large and very complex work, into Urdu, this must have been a major event of great significance to the entire movement in philosophy of that period. Anyway, moving from Deccan, he was very close to his brother, a man called Abu Khair. But Abu Khair made his career more in academic and scholarly circles, becoming a professor of Arabic and of Islamic studies at the Uthmaniyya University, associated with the Nizam of Hyderabad, who was then the center, as it were, of Muslim thought in India, Lucknow being more and more overshadowed by its overwhelming or increasing Hindu influence. So the scholarly Islamic centers of India in the 1930s moved more towards, in one case, Hyderabad, because the Nizam had the funds and had the interest in supporting Islamic scholars, and migrated also to the Dar al-Ulum of Deoband and the various movements associated with Jam'iyyat Ulama al-Hind. So in his early days, let's say up to the 1930s, he really pursued the normal career of a Muslim activist. He made a life in journalism, became editor of a number of newspapers, but was involved in the Khilafat movement that we talked about earlier. And through them, he became close to Jam'iyyat Ulama al-Hind, who were the main organizing body of Indian ulamas. It seems that his translations of Mullah Sadr may have affected a change in his life. And according to his biographer, Sayyid Wali Rida Nasr, who was the son of Sayyid Hussain Nasr, I suppose. This may have introduced into his thinking the notion of hikmah, of Islamic hikmah. So sometime around the 1930s, 32, 34, he seems to have undergone an important change. I won't say a life, sort of a career shift, more of a career shift and less of an epiphany, where he seems to have become somewhat disenchanted with purely a journalistic approach, and became more concerned about the fate of Islam and Muslims from a cultural and socio-political context rather than in strictly communal terms. Because the struggle in the 20s and 30s in India was to some extent communal, in the sense that how will Muslims maintain their integrity, dignity, and well-being if power is going to be transferred directly to the Hindu majority. And here he began to develop his main themes that later became the building blocks, as it were, of the Islamist ideology. And you will see that many of them have been absorbed into the thoughts of both Ikhwan Muslimin, especially Sayyid Qutb, who was very much influenced by A Allawi and Maududi, and then subsequently in all so-called revivalist movements, Islamic revivalist movements. Here he had, before he entered into the period when he was a great prolific writer on matters relating to the ideology, as it were, of Islam, or the religion of Islam in the 1940s. He tried to start a kind of living scholarly community by founding something called Dar al-Islam. This was a complex of buildings in a village several tens of miles away from Lahore, where he thought he will create a type of hybrid community that would attract both scholars as well as students in an environment that was work-oriented, that was also work and study-oriented, a kind of model Muslim village. This was backed by a few financial supporters. By the way, he himself was quite firm. He was firm in his finances. He married a lady who was quite wealthy, and he never seemed to be concerned about pecuniary or financial matters. He was in relatively good financial shape, both while he was in India and then when he moved on to Pakistan. It is there while he was acting as the principal of Dar al-Islam, which was, as I said, a kind of dormitory come academy, as it were, or an academic environment. He developed the key concept of what they call Urdu Islamic Hukumat, or Islamic government. And a lot of the notions that were first conceived by Maududi and then pioneered by him became, as it were, the stock and trade of the Islamic movement subsequently. He was very much opposed to the Muslim League of Muhammad Ali Jinnah, considering them to be a group of secularists who had no interest in Islam, but only interested in Muslims as basically a demographic base for their political program. And he was very ambivalent about Pakistan, or the notion of a separate Muslim homeland, in as much as it's going to fall under the control and fall under the influence of about secularists such as Jinnah and so on. So partly to compensate for the preeminence of the Muslim League in Muslim affairs, Muslim politics in India, and partly also as a result of his result of being catapulted in his thinking, in his intellectual endeavors, by his engagement with Mullah Sadra, by his translation of Mullah Sadra, and by, again, his evolution of the concept of Hukumat Islamiyya, English translation. He founded the Jama'ah in 1948. The program of Jama'ah, to a large extent, was probably the first political party in the Muslim world that was avowedly ideological. There were many parties or many political groups, or many groups that had Muslim or Islamic objectives, but the Jama'at was probably the first political party that evolved a specific ideology that was derived from the thoughts of a particular ideologue, in this case Abu Maududi, and that was based upon not so much the Sharia foundations of Islam, but rather the idealization of Islam as a conceptual framework for political and social action. This is really quite an important distinction, because while in the past people talk in terms of Islam as not just a system of rituals, but rather a civilizational and contextual framework in which man conducted himself. Here we have a conscious attempt to create an ideology that answers specifically to social concerns, political concerns, economic concerns, even military concerns. And it addresses itself also to the nature and structure of rule and into the details of rule that allow an entity to be called Islamic. So it is the ideologization, as it were, of Islam that subsequently became a standard feature, as it were, of nearly all Islamic political movements. That is, although they are purportedly based on the Quran and the Sunnah, and based on a certain understanding of Quranic precepts and concepts, in reality, they are a way in which the injunctions of Islam have been patterned in order to create an ideology that is digestible and that is also a source or action, movement of people. So this is really a short history of the Jama'at, and then we go, inshallah, into more details about the ideas of Abu al-Ala Maududi. The Jama'at split in 1947 into two factions. One that was content to stay in India, and the majority faction that moved with Maududi to Pakistan. In Pakistan, Maududi, as I said earlier, found himself really in direct confrontation with a state that had no room for his concept of what is Hukumat Islamic, what is an Islamic state. And he found himself early on in conflict with it, in conflict with aspects of the state that were antithetical. He found himself with a state that continued with British laws, continued with British procedures, and had structures of bureaucracy and administration and education that were entirely colonial in form and in content, although they were managed by, in this case, Pakistanis. Now, part of his definition of the Islamic, or Hukumat Islami as it were, really had little to do early on with power. So the Jama'at in Pakistan was not, in the early days, did not actually seek political power. It was more of a gadfly, it was more of a critic, it was more of a mobilizer of public opinion, rather than the seeker of political power. And again, finding himself unable to influence events, especially in the early 1950s, where there was a series of weak civilian rule. He started more of a direct action on the part of the Jama'at. And the Jama'at organized, or were involved in major anti-Ahmadi riots in Pakistan in the 1950s, upon which he was arrested and sentenced to death. His death sentence was subsequently, obviously, put aside, but he was considered to be a very disruptive force within the Pakistani elite structure. He tried to become close to Ayub Khan when Ayub Khan, the military dictator, or the military ruler of Pakistan in the 1950s, but there were too many people in the government and the state who were adamant against any concessions to Maududi and to his concept as to what an Islamic state should be like. Towards the end of the 1960s, he made a decision on behalf of his party to get involved in politics. They started competing for seats in parliament and seats and political power. And basically, Jama'at had not been very successful in seeking or achieving political power. He was very much against the socialism and socialist ideas imposed on the country by Bhutto. And he did not come luckily under the sway of the new centers of Islamic power and wealth, mainly Saudi Arabia, in the 1970s, and he died of a kidney ailment in 1979. This really is the sort of a thumbnail sketch of the history of the Jama'at, the history of Abu al-Ala Maududi. Now, we need to talk now about his ideas. What is it that he symbolizes? What are the concepts he elaborated? And how do these concepts enter into the discourse of the Islamic intellectual scene? To him, Islam really was not something primarily historical or traditional. He saw Islam in the context of being not only a modern ideology, but a modernist ideology. It's a perception, a conceptual framework that allowed a person to be modern in his, or contemporary in his perceptions and his approach and his conduct, but more importantly than that it defined what modern meant. So, to be modern, to be contemporary, to be always at the forefront of change, useful change, to be always at the edge of important developments, is really the prerogative of Islam. It is not that his Islam was not an Islam that looked backward. It was not an Islam based upon theoretical models constructed about ideal societies. It was a definition of modernism. Now, this has filtered in, you might be aware, into nearly all Islamic movements, whereby modernity is equated with the rediscovery and redefinition of Islam. So Islam, instead of being a a vision that is based upon primarily spiritual and religious injunctions, or a system of ordinances, or a historical experience, or a civilization framework, it becomes the defining features of what constitutes what really makes up the conception of a contemporary person or a modern person. So the process by which a person seeks modernity through Islam leads to him creating a sense of identity for himself. So the rediscovery of a Muslim's identity in the context of Islam as a modern ideology is what in his case, the Islamic movement or the Jama'at should do. So the whole program, the whole cycle, as it were, is to rediscover identity by equating Islam with all that is advanced and all that is good, all that is positive in modern civilization. And in fact, appropriating for Islam, or the other way around also, imposing on what is good, positive, what is useful, imposing on it an Islamic framework. So it becomes an entire redefinition of what passes for reality for an individual Muslim. And in this process of redefining identity, of redefining the modernity of Islam, there are certain precepts that are required in order for this to be fulfilled. And in this case, he emphasizes the importance and the criticality of power. All of what he talks about is like, it has really quite an extensive output. Is that if you look at it sort of sequentially, you have here modernity, which is equivalent to Islam. You have modern, which is contemporary, which is also equivalent to Islam. The redefinition of these at an individual level, or individual assimilation, leads to or helps in forming identity. For all of this to happen, you have to have power to do these things, power to create the framework whereby these functions, these relationships are realized. And without power, these relationships become purely theoretical and can at best be accepted at the individual rather than the social level. So another feature of the modern, or the, let's say, the post-war Islamic movement is the emphasis on the social rather than the individual. And by social here, I don't mean communal. It does not equal communal. It does not equal a sense of community. It is social in the sense of mujtama. So the movement from the concern of the individual and the concern of the community as a whole to a redefinition of society in social terms rather than in communal terms, and accepting to some extent the divisions of society that have been categorized by Western or let's call them modern sociologists and historians, is again part of the analytical framework of the modern Islamic movement. Now, in this case, how is this? What is the framework by which all of these things are realized? Obviously, you need power. So, the power that he was referring to, inshallah, we'll come to that later, is more to do with the power of large numbers of people acting collectively rather than the power of the state. And in fact, he conceived of Muslim power not so much in terms of governance, not so much in terms of controlling bureaucracies. That's why, for a very large period, for a very long period, he refused to allow the Jama'at to get involved in domestic politics. It is only after a redefinition of what these terms meant. His sense of power is more to do with social action, with action on a large canvas by a large number of people whose actions may coincide with the requirements of a state, but may transcend the requirements of the state. So, to him, the redefinition of the action of Muslims in the context of social action is to do with the rediscovery of the authenticity of Islam. And again, we'll come to that later in the writings of Sayyid Qutb, which is both of them have a very, very profound antipathy to nationalism, to nation states, to any modern political structures that impose geographic boundaries or divisions on Muslims. They try to inculcate into their ideology a true color blindness, race blindness, nation blindness, and ethnic and sectarian blindness. He was attacked by that quite a lot for that by a large number of ulama, especially in his critique of Muawiyah. He was one of the first people to write extensively about the change in the perceptions of Muslim rule as a result of the imposition of usurpers Umayyad authority on the Muslim world. And he was involved in all kinds of problems with Jam'iyyat Ulama al-Hind and also laterally with people in Saudi Arabia about his deep criticisms of the Umayyad regime and how it shifted the perceptions of Muslims from a community-based or a social-based political identity to one that is based upon states and bureaucracies and institutions of the state. So he saw nationalism primarily as a political and cultural threat to the identity of Muslims and to the ability of Muslims to rediscover their identity through the redefinition of Islam and modernity. Nationalism to him, because it emphasized certain peculiarities and elevated them to defining features of groups of people, and these peculiarities were not based upon divinely sanctioned ordinances, they were not based upon regulation, but they were based upon man-made conceptions of what constitutes groupings, legitimate groupings. He found them to be very, very threatening to the concept of the rediscovery of a Muslim's identity. And he fulminated in many cases against the threats of nationalism to the rediscovery of a Muslim's identity, because apart from being a confusing set of alternatives, it's also at various points antithetical to the divinely sanctioned order that he assumed to be the basis of any Islamic ideology. So, all of this he wanted to do is basically to shake the Muslims from a certain apathy, a certain sense of conventionality as to what Islam meant, a certain traditional perspective. Some ideas that were received, some ideas that were innovations, some practices that were antithetical to the rediscovery of identity. He wanted really to shake them out of it and to make them aware of the full potential of what an active Islamic ideology can mean, rather than a traditionally oriented received or naqli perceptions. So his movement, or his jama'at, as it were, and this also comes up with the, as it were, the adabiyat, or the rules, as it were, of all of the Islamic movements. If you follow the rules of conduct of the various political movements that you may be aware of, like the Dawah Party of Iraq, Muslim Brothers and so on, they are really very concerned about emphasizing the contemporary, modern definition of Islam, and they also reject at the same time what they think is a received and imperfect, and in some cases antithetical, traditional definition of Islam. So this idea that Islam means modernity, Islam means being contemporary, Islam means the aggressive pursuit of power, this is to do with the redefinition of the identity of a Muslim, from being a person who is passive, as being on the receiving end of kicks and butts, to being a more active, more dynamic person who has will, who has power, and who has ambition and desire to exercise it. His main works, there are really 4. He has infinite number of works. There's a whole bibliography of his works. Some of them are cited here. And he's very, very prolific author, according to his biography. Actually, before I came here, there was a symposium on in honor of Maududi in 1977. It was a very famous symposium held in Mecca, where the bibliography of his writings came to 10 pages. So he's quite a prolific writer. He had his main works on this type is what he calls this is his dream, his tafsir. And the importance of this tafsir is that it was written in the vernacular, in a way that people could understand. It wasn't highly stylized, it was very accessible. And apparently it was those Urdu speakers who have told me about it. It's a very powerful tafsir of Urdu. It has very high literary standards. So if you compare his career or his life, like I said, both were mufassirin, both were interpreters or commentators of the Quran. And in his case, he wrote it over 2 periods. One which leads up to Surah Yusuf, which was before his India days, and then the rest he completed while doing various times of jail. He was in and out of jail quite considerably, but never in a life-threatening way, never in a way that was... Generally, jail in Pakistan it's not very pleasant, but it's not life-threatening, as it is in the Arab world. So, this is his famous tafsir. It's still available now. If you write to the Islamic Foundation in Leicester, they will supply you quite a lot. His thesis on the Islamic identity came something called Risala Diniyat. This was written in 1932. And the tafsir was between 1940 and 1965. And then the ethics of Islam, he called it Islamic College. This came out in 1955. His most famous follower, or intellectual follower, is an American Jewish lady convert to Islam by the name of Maryam Jamila. She was like a repository of his works. She built upon them and became the most recognized of his intellectual interpreters, or his intellectual heirs.
Did she live in Islam? Did she live in Islam?
I think so, yes, she lived in Islam. She has a number of really quite good works. I mean, she's more of a pamphleteer than a thinker. But she considered herself to be the interpreter and the keeper, as it were, of his memory.
What everybody should know about Muslims and Islam at that time.
Muslims and Islam?
What everybody should know about Muslims and Islam.
It might be a bit dated because these figures were all sort of active in the 60s, probably before you were born, 60s and 70s. But I mean, my generation was quite an important source of history. So let's continue with the ideas that we'll have. If there's any questions or elaborations, please.
Yes. Yeah, you mentioned one point on Imam al-Jina.
Yes.
That there was a trouble between them, but I didn't get the cause.
Well, Muhammad Ali Jinnah was a very controversial figure. I mean, he certainly was not, Allahu A'lam, but in his actions he was not that of a believer. His main approach to, or the way that he defined his politics in India was really in trying to create a political community out of Muslims. To him, the Muslim community, because they had certain shared experiences and certain background, are different from the Hindu community. And therefore, the idea of difference is what drove him towards asking or calling for, first of all, a high degree of autonomy for the Muslims and then finally partition. But Muhammad Ali Jinnah certainly was not a great Islamist. He certainly was not an activist in the sense that he wanted to enshrine Islam in the form of Sharia, in the form of personal conduct. In many ways, his personal conduct was antithetical to Islam. I mean, he was probably an imbiber of various forms of drink, and in his own personal life, he had very little regard for either the ulamas or for the outer aspects of the deen. once is a very famous case where he was asked, his Urdu was non-existent practically, he had to relearn it. English was his first language. To him, once Pakistan was established as quote-unquote a homeland for Muslims, it had no reason for it to have any religious features to it. And Islam had no reason for it to be enshrined or to be established as the state ideology. Neither was there any reason to restructure society and administration and culture according to Islam. In fact, he thought of it as probably a backward phenomenon. So, if you talk to many people now, the notion of him as the founder of the state always takes precedence over him as a Muslim or a person who sought for the establishment of Islam as the guiding framework for the country. And I think Maududi saw through that. And the whole Muslim League, because it's basically a creation, not a creation, but it's basically a one-man show. I mean, without Janah, there would not be Pakistan. It's as simple as that. It was energy and drive and determination and vision. And his very dry, legalistic approach to problem solving. And he could go on and argue hours and hours and hours and hours and days until he got the other side to concede a small point. And without these skills, Pakistan would have happened. But it certainly was not going to be an Islamic state. In fact, his first speech that he gave was that this country will be based upon democracy, based upon respect for other religions and so on and so forth. So to him, Islam was a secondary aspect. It was just a defining title for groups of people who may have a similar culture. So we come across again another key idea of, let's say, the progenitors of the modern Islamic movement, and that is the idea of tajdeed, or purification. And we find many people talking about it. What is real? This is not real Islam. And real Islam is this. And implying that what we have in front of us, or what they have in front of them, is something that is somehow incomplete, something that has been distorted, somehow something that has been added to and has changed its character. So most modern Islamic thought is very much concerned with the idea of the concept of to purify the religion from its embellishments, to purify practice from false forms, to renew, to reborn, as it were, to give it a rebirth. The whole idea of there being something that was pristine and somehow it has been a continuous decline since then, and now it's being revivified, is something that is quite common to most of the Islamic modernist Islamists. And this came partly, well, not exclusively, from the thoughts of Maududi, which a lot of his writings talk about the need for purifying. We need to purify the individual, we need to purify society, mainly from false, what he calls, or what has been called, false notions of Islam. So to them, they obviously represent real Islam. The other side represents, or the rest of society represents falsehood, incompletion, and a form that is not necessarily authentic. So, back again to him, in order for him to create Islam as an ideology, you obviously have to remove from it various practices and methods of thinking and perceptions that are not authentic. And this ideology, well, all ideologies are to do with social rather than individual action. So Islam moves from being an individual creed, a profession of faith, to being a process by which large groups of people combine their energies and efforts. So this transfer, as it were, of the ideology of Islam from individual salvation to societal action is part of the changeover, the makeover that was given to Islamic thought by people like Maududi. And we'll see others also. Here, he came up, part of the process of purification of Islam is to emphasize, obviously, the cardinal features of a purified deen, and that is absolute submission to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is not really seen in terms of an individual solution. It's to do with recognition that all else has to be rejected. So part of the process of renewal is to redefine Tawheed at the individual level, or to reconfirm Tawheed at the individual level by basically denying the existence of any reality, including the reality of potential free will to man. So in one of his works, he basically denounced the possibility, or rejected the possibility, that man can have any notion of free will, and that everything therefore has to depend upon the first step of the process is to submit to the first portion, Shahada. And in this process, if you define Islam or Islamic history or Islamic action as being the action of people who are in absolute Tawheed, then what you have really is not Islamic history, you have Islamic unhistory. Because everything else, you start off from an ideal point, say Medina. And then everything else goes down. So whatever happens in the intervening period has nothing to do with Islam, or has lesser degrees of involvement in Islam. Again, this process of redefining what is Islamic as being an element of recovery of the purity of the deen, and everything in between is somehow aberrant, is again part of the mindset, as it were, of Islamic revivalists or modernists. So there's no such thing as Islamic history. There's no such thing as it has been a process of decay and decline, because people have not, or the rulers or society as a whole, has not accepted the principles of Tawheed. And if you accept the principles of Tawheed, then your starting point must be the rule of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and not the rule of man. And anything in between has been that much distance being put between what is an ideal Muslim society and what is reality of the individual at the present moment in time. So, again, we'll see that also coming up in the thoughts of Sayyid Qutb, that there is an ideal, and that ideal is being corrupted, and therefore we cannot draw any... I shouldn't say that, actually. I would say it is, of course, mainly concerned with spiritual, but it brings into the tafsir literature, as it were, an approach that was hitherto limited. The only person who had written about it in great significance was Muhammad Abdi, and to some extent Rashid Rida. But here we have a systematic attempt to bend the Quran in ways that are important to contemporary audiences. And here again, I try to glean what the notion of religion, what does a religious experience mean to a Muslim, and especially a Muslim in Tawheed. And Abu Ala defines, or the Bible, into recognition of 4 precepts. One is divinity, the Ilahi. Next one is lordship, or Maududi. The Muslim in Tawheed has to move through these various phases of perceptions and recognitions in order to reach a unified field theory, as it were, of his deen. And without a sense of the sacred, without the sense of the ghaib, without the sense of the unseen, without the sense that the unseen commands and that the unseen holds the keys to the experience of man, it is not possible to construct Islamic Tawheed. This is sui generis, it defines itself. Once you recognize the element of the unseen, you move into recognition of the nature of the rububiyyah or lordship, that the force that governs the unseen is the same that governs the seen, and that if you submit to the unseen, you have to submit to the master of the unseen. And the process of submission involves ibadah, involves worship. And this whole cycle is seen in the form of religious experience that elevates and that spiritualizes man. And that this whole process of unfolding, as it were, you cannot start it at one point and go back to the other. You cannot take lordship without ilahiyya. You cannot take ibadah without belief in the unseen, and without belief in lordship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You cannot take the practices and rituals of the deen without any of these elements. So all of these elements feed into each other. And all of these elements build up the sense of the deen of Islam in an individual that is necessary as the principal building block of reconstructing society.
Would it be possible to do it in verse? These things?
Well, no, to him these are interrelated. They are not, it is not, I describe them as a sequence, but they are interrelated. One cannot be sustained without the other. The sense of ilahiyya, for example, the sense of the unseen, has no meaning if it's not ritualized, and if it's not confined, and if it's not, if it does not entail submission. Submission without ilahiyya can mean submission to man. Ibadah without ilahiyya can mean just going to the Friday Jum'ahs and whatever. Deen without all of these religion as a system of beliefs and conducts and rituals and so on, without any of these is incomplete. So it's basically a complete system that feeds into each other and creates the conditions whereby an individual can feel total religious experience, or at least can try to feel a total religious experience. And this is the necessary foundation for any Islamic action. There's a lot more that one can say, but the time that we have is also restricted. One can spend several lectures on Bilal Maududi, as well as Sayyid Qutb, so you have to excuse me for not going into it to the depth that it deserves. Now, this brings us to another point, which is the political or the social action aspects of the ideology of the Jama'at, which also become the ideology of the Islamic College until the formation of the Islamic State in Iran. And here is that none of this can happen without revolution. But by revolution, it doesn't necessarily mean, in fact, it didn't mean the violent overthrow of the political order. We talk revolution in terms of the destruction of the existing social norms. And you do that by undermining the existing setup. The existing setup that you have is not conducive for a Muslim to rediscover his identity and authenticity, and is not conducive for a Muslim to try to be Tawheed. So the way it has to be done is through constant chipping away at the foundations of modern secular societies. And this really takes place through the ethical makeup, the akhlaqi makeup, as it were, of society. And that if you replace the ethics of Islam in terms of personal behavior, personal conduct, personal transactions, social behavior, social conduct, social transactions, you will in time undermine the basis of modern secularism and lead to a change in perception and consciousness of people. And revolution, that is turning things upside down, changing one for another, is not something that should be or necessarily ought to be violent, but should be one that leads people, or individuals, and then large groups of people, to change their perceptions of things through a reconstruction of their ethical consciousness. And here we focus on two key aspects, and this has been really the themes of the Jama'at throughout. One is to concentrate on leaders, to change the perceptions and the consciousness of people in leadership positions. And secondly, through educational foundations, educational institutions. And that both of these, this is from the top down and this is from the bottom up, will lead to a change in the ethical consciousness of people and will lead to So you hear a lot about how the Jama'at have not been able to get many seats in parliament and so on and so forth, as indicating how isolated or how little support they have. In actual fact, this is not their main key, as far as I know until recently, is that they have been very, very successful in at least re-Islamizing part of the elites, especially Pakistan, towards a more ethical base of conduct. Of course, the more a portion of the elite becomes re-confirmed ethically, it is more than overcompensated for by the increasing arrogance and the increasing oppression of the other section of the elite. So, all this led to the concept of the Hukumat Islamic, or Islamic State, where all of these things are supposed to happen. As I said earlier, his concept of the Islamic State is primarily cultural and ethical. It is not political. It has very little to do with seizing political power and redefining what the Islamic State is. However, if a group or a large community of Muslims want to create a system of government for themselves, then that system of government should have certain hierarchies and structures. And here he talks about a form of Imam al-Salih, which is what Sayyid Qutb talks about. But he talks in terms about Amir al-Adil, a just prince or a just ruler who is elected. So he gives a certain role, actually a defining role, to the population as a whole, if they are in Tawheed, the right to elect their leader. And this is the Imara established by a popularly elected person, is basically the peak, as it were, of the political redefinition of the Islamic State.
How does it differentiate it from democracy when the populace in Tawheed can elect their ruler?
He doesn't. I mean, this is his. He brings it. He brings it to fruition. Really. I mean, his ideal state is run by a popularly elected emir. In some ways, his relationship with democracy as a system or as a process was not negative, positive. I mean, he thought he saw democracy as a legitimate way, in the sense of voting and so on, of expressing the will. But the top of the state, the peak of stateful power, should be a democratically or popularly elected representative. This doesn't apply, by the way, to the next tier of authority, which is Shura, which he limited to the Ahl al-Hal wal-Aqd. He limited to people who have the right attributes to advise. And they have no control over the Emir. They are only in advisory capacity. So, the executive authority in an Islamic state, if the top of the authority, the peak of the authority, is the rightly guided or rightly elected Emir, he can only be advised by Al-Hal. He cannot be, but the Emir can be removed by the people in the subsequent process. It's a curious amalgam that was partly taken up by the Islamic State in Iran. I mean, you have a popularly elected, but of course the definition of Shura in Iran is far wider and measures has far more powers and authority. Here is purely consultative, with power being ceded to a large extent to the executive. He also wrote a lot about economics and economic aspects of the Hukumat Islam. He wrote a lot against the usage of interest and the abolition of riba and so on. So, we've talked a bit about Sayyid Qutb now. Sayyid Qutb is a tragic figure, because he's one of the leading intellectuals who found his apotheosis by being executed. And he shares, I suppose, in the gallery of heroes of the Islamic movement, private place, Syria, Shaykh al-Sadr, because there are people who were martyred for their thoughts. In the case of Sayyid Qutb, was probably the first to suffer this fate. And he suffered this fate at the hands of a person who generally has a good press amongst large segments of the third world. Sayyid Qutb was born relatively poor background in Egypt, and joined the Ikhwan at an early age. Was very much of course influenced by Hassan and rose to become one of their leading theoreticians and the editor of the newspaper. The Ikhwan suffered a major blow. I don't have much time to talk about his life, so I'll spend more time talking about his ideas, just very, very often. The Ikhwan suffered, as I said, a blow in 1954. They had participated obliquely in the coup that brought the three officers led by Nasser to power in 1952. But Nasser turned against them, and they had a botched-up attempt to kill him in 1954, which led to a massive clampdown, which involved hundreds of them being arrested, several were executed, and Sayyid Qutb was in and out of jail. Finally, he was held up for being against the ideas of Arab socialism, and they connected him with some concocted plot together with four other people, and in spite of the huge international outcry and outrage by many people in Muslim world, including King Faisal of Saudi Arabia, and believe it or not, the Shah of Iran, he was executed nevertheless. So he was probably the foremost thinker, the foremost ideologue of the Ikhwan Muslimin, and I don't think they produced anybody of his caliber since then. A great deal of what we consider to be the discourse of the Islamic movement is due to Sayyid Qutb, especially in the Arabic-speaking countries. And generally in the Muslim world, the pride of place is divided between Sayyid Qutb and Lahab. His main...
Was he well known before the arrest and the death sentence?
Yes. You might have heard of his brother, Muhammad Qutb. It's more of a literary culture. His two key works, Sayyid Qutb, are his massive tafsir to the Quran, which we can devote many days to, which means the shadow of the Quran, or in the shade, which is a complete socio-political tafsir. Very, very learned not in its theological side, because theologically it's to a large extent Ibn Kathir's tafsir, modernist. Ibn Kathir, by the way, is, I'm sure you know that, is the principal source of commentaries for the modernist Salafis. But by introducing a great deal of socio-political dimension to tafsir, he gave it a very powerful modern bent, which frankly in the 1960s, we came across it. It was really revolutionary. I mean, the first time I read it, it was a revolution on a number of counts. First count was the language, very accessible, very easy to read. The Arabic is quite accessible. Without too many, he uses modern words, modern concepts. He writes, as it were, in 20th century rather than classical. His grammar is excellent, of course, but the way it's written is accessible, it's easy to understand. The second way in which it's very profound is the fresh contemporary approach he brings to some of the Quranic ayahs, especially as they relate to matters of immediate political concern. If you're a man in your 20s or more than your 20s and you read this, you find that there's a great deal of concern with issues of an immediate nature, things to do with poverty, with authority, with rights, with obligations, apart from the ethical dimensions. So it was topical from that perspective. And because it was a forbidden in some ways, because the man associated with it seemed to be a revolutionary, it added that much more spice. The other book that he is well known for, and has become a handbook of the Islamic movements, is a book called A Allawi. This is available, and if you have it's available in English, if you have a chance, buy it. It's course, you'll find a lot of the ideas that you may think are associated with this thinker or that author are really his. So, in many ways, in order to the Muslim.
Would you say it's dated now?
Sorry?
Would you believe that this work is dated now?
Oh, yes. So, it's dated, but it wasn't dated in the 1970s or 60s. 19th century was like a thunder.
Or not 1980s?
I'm in the day?
Yeah. Standard handbook.
So you can give it up. I'm not trying to push a couple on you on milestones, but these are, and this is a course on Islamic thought in the 20th century, and this is a milestone in Islamic thought. A lot of it is dated. If you read, say, Bakr Sadr's decided that it's extremely dated. In fact, in some ways it's available in utility. Rereading the milestones which I did in order to give the story. The milestone is divided into 10 chapters. Each one deals with a certain facet of the redefinition, as it were, of the identity of the Muslim. In chapter 1, it talks about the uniqueness of the first Quranic generation. And this is really to set the stage for his key concept, which is the concept of Jahiliyyah. This, of course, is entered into, again, the lexicon of Islam. The uniqueness of the first Quranic generation to him is really what sets the standard. It's again the Medinan ideal, the Medinan model. It is the way in which any Muslim society, or Islamic society, has to reorganize itself in order to achieve the ideals of the first generation, or the first Quranic generation. And why this is important for establishing the standard, what is the rationale behind the greatness of the first Quranic generation? And his rationale is because, again, going back to Maududi's idea of Tawheed and the primacy of La ilaha illallah, is that here you have a direct connection between revelation, prophetic conduct, and people around the Prophet. So this first group of people must have exhibited the true nature, or the true makeup of the Islamic society much earlier, in much more perfect form than anything that came subsequently. And if you are to believe that the first Quranic generation is the model for future action, then it is also the mechanism by which you reintroduce Tawheed and reject the non-Tawheedi elements of it, which are his other notion of Jahiliyyah. He then talks about how the Quran itself addresses it. So to do with Quranic method. And here his contribution, as it were, to the studies of the Quran is to introduce the idea that there is a certain methodology by which the Quran unfolds to man, and that it addresses man as man. It addresses the concept of man as defined by man himself, as defined by the ultimate sustainer and creator. And any other method of understanding or relating to man fails because this is a revelatory method that is divinely sanctioned. So what is man is what is defined as man in the Quran, and that human civilization cannot fall outside of the parameters of the Quranic definition of man, which in turn is defined as it were under the canopy of La ilaha illallah. And here again we have the issue of the Mecca-Medina paradigm, how man is introduced to the divinity, introduced to the rububiyyah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala through Meccan revelations, through the ayahs and the surahs that came down in Mecca, and how that unfolded to show other dimensions of man, to show social man, family man, political man, all of these other facets of humanity are then unfolded in subsequent orders and subsequent methods and mechanisms that ultimately created the notion of how society should be organized, which is the Medina model. So the method of the Quran is to teach man about his humanity. But you start by recognition of his subservience to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So that the order of descent of the ayahs relate to the self-knowledge of man. You start by knowing your limitation, your thought, and then you end up through recognition of the supremacy of the divine in a state that is based upon certain rules and ordinances and injunctions, which is the Medina model. So as it were, the Quranic method is unfolding over time from the most sublime, as it were, to the most mundane, not in the sense of being low, but in the sense of being worldly, the Medina. So it is a process by which humanity understands itself. And here we come again to the notion of each of these stages which man goes through, humanity goes through, in order to understand how it is evolved and how it should organize itself, is a form of jihad. And the nature of jihad, and the nature of the struggle, changes as you move along the scale from Mecca to Medina. The jihad, the first element of jihad is to recognize your father and your submission. And the final element of jihad may very well be go out and fight a war and kill people and so on. So his critique, as it were, and he writes quite a lot about that in his book, about not Orientalists, but apologists of the Western and the secular mode, is that they try to impose illegitimate definitions, for example, on key Quranic concepts. That jihad is really valid only in defense. There is no offensive aspect of it. So no, this is nonsense. There are various kinds of jihad, and each jihad is relevant and necessary and legitimate for a specific stage of evolution. And if there are people attacking you, you're in defensive jihad. But you're in offensive jihad if you want to propagate, if you want to advance, if you want to establish the hukm of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the notion of struggle and the notion of jihad is related to the unfolding, as it were, of the humanity of man. We come to the third chapter, which is probably the defining chapter of the single most important concept that he brought to Islamic thought, which is the elaboration of what Jahiliyyah is. Characteristics of Jahiliyyah. Jahiliyyah, he says, is any society or any action which does not have La ilaha illallah as its feature, as its defining feature. So it is not really the society of Arabs before Prophet. It is not the society of ignorance before the emergence of Islam and its temple. It is any system, any thought, any action, any complex of programs, policies, thoughts, concepts, behavior, values that does not submit to Allah. So basically, society as a whole is in Jahiliyyah. And that what we have here is various forms of Jahiliyyah, various forms of ignorance which have to be removed. And this, of course, when you use the word Jahiliyyah, which has a certain theological and fiqhi concept, you cannot throw it out, you cannot call people around Jahiliyyah, because basically what you're using is kufr. He spread the notion of what constitutes societies that are in kufr to include nominal Muslim societies, or partially Islamic societies, thereby turning large segments of the Muslim world into societies that are in Jahiliyyah, societies that it is not only correct but virtuous to fight against. And this, of course, has come into modern usage in various societies, the takfir al-hijrah, taking this to extreme, what the people are doing in Algeria, and so on. That is, you postulate what constitutes Islam, and then what is not what you postulate is not a form of Islam, but is a form of ignorance, and therefore must be crushed, and therefore must be driven into submission. And in some ways, when it first came about, this idea was extremely profound. I mean, it allowed people to take positions, probably for the first time, against rulers who may go to lead the Jumu'ah prayers, who may build mosques, who may start their speeches by Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, who overtly appear to help Islam, but in reality are enemies of Islam. And this broadened, as it were, the front against the ruling groups that inherited power in the Muslim world from the foreign powers or colonial powers. So, this, I think, is a key concept that he brought into the vocabulary of the Islamic world, and he gives it, I think, quite a deep treatment.
Could I ask, is there any similarity between his concept of Jahiliyyah and, say, what Maududi?
No, Abdullah doesn't talk about Jahiliyyah. He talks about impartial, incomplete. He talks about people about elites who are nevertheless reformable. Sayyid Qutb takes it further. Of course, you have to take into account what happened in Egypt in the late 50s and 60s to try to put his concepts into some kind of historical framework. But his Jahiliyyah is far more pervasive because, as I'll try to explain it at the time, that it included any deviation from very narrowly defined Islamic verities or virtues. Any deviation from that constitutes Jahiliyyah. He was under the belief, partly right. Then it was right, now it's not so much right, because now it's much more complex. That the ruling groups are completely immersed in kufr, and that they happen to be imposed on us. They would rather be somewhere else, so they're really interested only in sweating us all to death, extracting what they can from us, and hope over time that they will either crush our spirit or they will change us into something that is more akin to that. And this may be true probably in the first generation of secular modernists and nationalists who ruled in most of these countries. Things are much more complex now, and you can't really accuse people with the same kind of sweep as you could.
These ideas, what did he write them before he went to study in America?
No, all this came after he spent 2 years in America. He came back to America really quite profoundly shaken. There was a lot there were personal reasons. He's quite a complex man. He must have suffered a lot of personal level. But his personal life was not very happy. But that's, I don't have time to talk about his biography. He came back from America convinced that civilization means Islam. Means everybody else is really not forms of kufr, but forms of uncivilization.
Was he Nubian in origin?
Sorry?
Was he Nubian in origin? From the Nuba region? Yeah.
No, I don't think he was Nubian, but he was African.
So I was wondering if he was in America, what type of response did he get?
Yeah, he must have suffered a great deal. In the 1950s in New York. You should do it. You know what's amazing. Anyway. Now, his attempt to elevate Islam into a working program for political people, for young people, and his attempt to structure it in ways that are digestible, and also in ways that are enforceable. You reinforce your belief in Islam. And here we talk about Islam as being the most practical, i.e. the most utilitarian of religions, because it deals with people as they are. It allows its ordinances and injunctions to be phased in rather than imposed and whole. It is open to usage of new thoughts, new ideas, new resources without losing its essence. Deals with people. It uses new resources and techniques without losing its essence. It forms a legal foundation for society. Don't forget, this way it's written is up to some extent, he's responding to other rights, established as rights of man by making man subservient to God and not to man. So freedom and dignity of man is maintained by his submission to his Creator and not to other men. Please impose a certain rigidity and a certain frame on the duties of man to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is perhaps due also to the way in which the Azhar managed to accommodate Abdul Nasser in each and every one of his major shifts of policy and direction. And here we come across the idea that Islam is a complete way of life, and it is not just a religion, it is a system that exists as a result of man making a choice of being subservient to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that the foundations of any community or any family that is Islamic has to be based upon this original tawheed. Any society where this submission is not acknowledged at all levels, at the level of culture, at the level of language, at the level of is also has the same degree or the same condition of complete, we have to submit to it with the same degree of subservience, as it were, as we do to the laws of the universe. And the laws of the universe, in as much as they are the governing factors behind the way that we interact with the world, are real, and therefore we cannot go against the law of gravity, for example. The same set of laws apply to our inner condition, our inner state of being subservient to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So, while we may talk about the natural constraints on man as being part of the universal order, there's also inner constraints on man that come from his subservience to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And any civilization is by its nature, any society that recognizes this is by its nature a civilized society. And therefore, you cannot talk about Islamic civilization. Civilization is Islam. And here he entered into a debate, as it were, with some Algerian writers like Maududi. We talk about the nature of civilization and whether we can use the term Islamic civilization. And he was very much against the idea of the word Islamic as an adjective. And that Islamic concept, Islamic culture, is really the expression of a society of submission. It is not something that you use as an adjective, as a descriptive. It is a defining feature of Islam. So,
Why?
sorry?
Why?
Because to be civilized, man must be imperfect. And therefore, the material civilization, whatever advance you have in material civilization, is according to Allah. If it does not reflect your submission to La ilaha illallah, then it is an incomplete civilization. In fact, you can't use the word civilization. Because if the concept of the Quran, the methodology of the Quran, and the unfolding of what man is starts with La ilaha illallah, then you cannot have a society that claims to be civilized unless it starts with that. There's a certain tautology of this, but nevertheless, it seems to be a complete system as far as many Islamists. So, that is again, it's a tautology in the sense that you define your starting premise and then everything unfolds as a result of that. Of course, this is, I don't want to get into that, this is dangerous grounds. So, again, here we go to the notion that Sharia is not really a system of rules and laws. It is more to do with the the organizational expression of the civilization of Tawheed. It can include anything. You can have a Sharia of adab, for example, or literature, or art, or whatever. But in the process, because Islam unfolds and has responses to each and every condition of man, therefore, Islam should be really indifferent to things of utility, like physics or chemistry. Islam should only be concerned where what may be utilitarian, useful, has been changed and given certain speculative philosophical aspects. For example, he says the theory of evolution of Darwin may make sense scientifically. I don't think he was in a position to comment on it scientifically, but he used that as an example. But you cannot use the theory of evolution in order to make statements about the condition of man. You can only use it as a certain verifiable or nearly verifiable experimental state. But you can't say that man is came from apes, and we're all apes, and therefore there is no God. Similarly, if you want to just bring it up to date, you can't speculate about, you can talk about the Big Bang, you can talk about how the universe was created, the original explosion from one infinitesimal black hole. But you can't say that this demonstrates that the universe is created or uncreated. Where there are matters to do with ethics, matters to do with meaning, with mind, you go back to the Quranic definition, you go back to anything is useful as long as you do not reach conclusions of an ethical nature from it.
Sorry, I'm getting a bit confused. Are you saying that he's a utilitarian?
Yeah, I mean, most Islamic scholars are utilitarian. Sometimes I'm shocked to see how utilitarian they are. The utilitarian in the sense, it's fine to use technology, it's fine to study sciences, it's fine to take your knowledge from whatever college you are in, abroad, whatever. However, where that knowledge leads to speculation about existence, the nature of existence, leads to speculation about the Godhead, leads to speculation about the origin of man and so on. Here you have to put a red line, because red line, you're entering into a terrain that has already been defined for you. So, most people, most Islamists do not see, maybe on the side, do not see that technological society or techno-user, techno-financial society is in itself a system that encloses in it certain features that are profoundly kufr. And you can't really differentiate going to a Western university and studying physics from the overall environment, or the overall scheme with which that knowledge was generated. And in some ways, when I say he's dated, he's more polemical than he is a deep thinker. And this is mainly somewhat true also for Abu Arabi, is that the quality of their thought is not as rooted either in foreign philosophy. It's more to do with changing perceptions, changing attitudes.
So for this whole thing, I think of utilitarianism, I think of entering the mill. He's not in that sense.
No, talking the curve. His last chapter deals with the meaning of nation to a Muslim. And to some extent, this is in reaction to the Arab nationalist ideology that swept the Arab world in the late 50s and 60s. And here it is really just a redefinition that the Ummah of Islam is the final and the beginning point of loyalty to any Muslim. And it must go loyalty to that, to Darul Islam. Loyalty to the Ummah is greater, must be greater than loyalty to family, than loyalty to race, to color, to nation, to whatever. And that if the nationality of a Muslim, his true Ummah is defined in the context of the community of believers, then whatever is imposed on it is merely transient, is merely passing phase. So it is, I suppose, a reaffirmation of the modern conception of the illegitimacy or loyalty of the believer to anything but the community of believers. Now, that doesn't mean you can't have subsidiary loyalties. You can have subsidiary loyalties, but they have to be secondary to the primary one of loyalty to the Ummah, loyalty to the community, rather than. And he uses many examples. The Prophet ﷺ, how he was had to turn against his own family, against his cousin, Jahl, and Ghair, all these people. And how many of the early Sahaba abandoned their families, their country, for deen. This is the model if you go back to the first Quranic generation.
You see when the people, groups such as Tahrir and Muhajirun got their concepts from. Because these are very understandable, very clear, and in some ways they can be used, I'm not saying they're bad, they can be used in doctrine in a very quick manner.
They're digested.
Yes.
And they were structured in ways that, again, you have to see it in the context of the times. I'm talking about very strong communist movements that come to the fore. And they have brought things down to kind of neat paths where it's going.
Was Maududi ever influenced by Iqbal?
No. He had many meetings with him, but he wasn't.
Probably because of the short time of the lecture, he didn't go into details. I just want to know why and how did he manage to become from journalism to switch to become such a mass mover?
Well, he moved from his journalistic exercise to being asked to advise on the condition of Islamic da'wah in Hyderabad. So that may have helped him in this.
So he's always been Islamic throughout his life.
Yes. But the channels that he used changed. But he seems to have gone into second gear, as it were, in his 30s. Because he was going through a sort of an ordinary journalistic career, very polemical, very propaganda-oriented, into moving into an organization.
Did he have any kind of pathway education?
No.
He was self-taught,
Yes, to some extent. He's taught very well by his father.
His father is a scholar.
Scholar, yes. I said he retreated from the world and was very, very concerned about the education of his two sons. So a lot of them were self. But he mastered Arabic very, very well. Very fluent.
Persian?
Persian too. Otherwise, how do you comment? Well, Mullah Sadeh wrote